I witnessed the auctioneer's gavel slam down at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything the moment I became the owner of the most contaminated warehouse in Chicago's industrial district for exactly $1. The hazmat team I hired 3 days later would uncover something beneath layers of chemical waste that made international headlines. A forgotten vault containing $450 million worth of stolen masterpieces that had vanished from museums worldwide over 5 decades. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. My name is Marcus Chen, and until 6 months ago, I was just another struggling contractor in Chicago, specializing in environmental cleanup projects that nobody else wanted to touch. At 42, with a small crew of 5 guys and more debt than I care to admit, I was one bad contract away from bankruptcy. The call about the warehouse auction came from my former colleague, Tony, who worked at the city planning office. "Marcus, you need to get down here." Tony's voice crackled through my phone on that humid September morning. "The city's auctioning off that old Brennan Industries warehouse on South Paulina. Starting bid is $1. I knew the property. Everyone in the environmental cleanup business knew about it. The Brennan warehouse had been abandoned since 1987 when the EPA shut it down for massive chemical violations. For 35 years, it sat there like a cancer on the industrial landscape, too expensive for anyone to remediate, too toxic for the city to touch without massive liability issues. Why would I want that nightmare? I asked, watching my crew load equipment for our current job, cleaning up a small oil spill at a local garage. "Because they're offering full liability protection to whoever takes it," Tony said. "The city council finally got fed up. They'll cover all cleanup costs up to $5 million, plus give you ownership of whatever's left standing. All you have to do is make it safe." My rational mind screamed warnings. The Brennan warehouse was a 40,000 square foot monster of corroding metal and crumbling concrete, surrounded by a chain link fence decorated with biohazard warnings in 3 languages. Local urban explorers called it the Toxic Temple, and even they wouldn't go near it. But $5 million in cleanup funds with no liability? For a contractor drowning in equipment loans and payroll pressure, it was like someone offering a lifeline made of barbed wire dangerous to grab, but possibly the only thing that could pull me out. I arrived at the auction 15 minutes before it started. The courthouse basement room smelled of burnt coffee and disappointment, filled with maybe 12 people total. Most were reporters, there to document what the Tribune had called the city's last-ditch chemical gamble. The only other serious bidder was Richard Holbrook from Holbrook Demolition, a man who'd built his fortune on tearing down what others had abandoned. "Chen?" Holbrook nodded as I sat 2 rows behind him. "Didn't think environmental cleanup paid enough for you to play with the big boys." "Just curious," I lied, my palms sweating as I gripped the bidding paddle they'd given me at registration. The auctioneer, a thin man named Walsh, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat. "Lot 447, the former Brennan Industries warehouse at 4557 South Paulina Street. Due to the unique circumstances of this property, bidding will start at $1. "Do I have $1? Holbrook raised his paddle immediately. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal. $1 from bidder 7? "Do I have 2? My hand moved almost involuntarily. $2. Holbrook turned, his expression shifting from amused to annoyed. We went back and forth. $3, $4, $5. At $10, Holbrook stood up. $100, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to getting what he wanted. The room fell silent. $100 was still nothing for a property that size, but it established dominance. It said, "I'm serious, and you're not." I thought about my daughter Emma, starting college next year. About my wife Sarah, who'd been working double shifts at the hospital to help cover our bills. About my crew, good men, who deserve steady work and reliable paychecks. 101. Holbrook's face flushed red. 500. 501. This is ridiculous. Holbrook snarled. "You know what that place is? You know what it'll cost to bidder 7. Do you wish to continue?" The auctioneer interrupted. Holbrook glared at me, calculating. Later, I'd learned he'd already lined up a buyer for the cleared land, a developer planning luxury condos. But standing there, all I saw was a man used to crushing smaller competitors, suddenly realizing the ant had teeth. $1,000, he said finally. I stood up slowly, meeting his stare. $1. You already bid. One additional dollar. 1,001. The auctioneer looked between us like a referee at a particularly sad boxing match. $1,001 from bidder 12. Bidder 7? Holbrook's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. The reporters leaned forward, sensing drama in what should have been a routine municipal disposal. The silence stretched, elastic and tense. Bidder 7? Forget it. Holbrook spat, throwing his paddle on the chair. Let him choke on it. That place will eat every penny of the cleanup fund and then some. Hope you've got good lawyers, Chin. He stormed out, his footsteps echoing in the basement hallway. The auctioneer waited a respectful beat before continuing. $1,001. Going once, going twice. Sold to bidder 12. The gavel came down with a sound like a judge pronouncing sentence, which, in a way, it was. The next 3 weeks were a blur of paperwork, permits, and increasingly worried looks from Sarah as I explained what I'd done. The city was true to their word, the liability protection was ironclad, and the $5 million cleanup fund was real. But as I assembled my hazmat team and began planning the remediation, the scope of what I'd taken on became terrifyingly clear. The warehouse had been used for everything industrial Chicago could throw at it since 1923. Paint manufacturing in the 20s, pesticide storage in the 40s, chemical processing in the 60s. By the time Brennan Industries took over in 1975, the building was already a toxic layer cake of industrial sins. They'd just added the frosting illegal waste disposal that turned the basement into a chemical soup that could strip paint just from the fumes. "You sure about this, boss?" asked James, my lead foreman, as we stood outside the fence on our first official day. He was suited up in full hazmat gear, looking like an astronaut about to explore an alien planet, which wasn't far from the truth. "No," I admitted, checking the seal on my own respirator. "But we're here now." The first thing that hit us was the smell. Even through the protective gear, it was overwhelming, a mixture of rotting eggs, burnt plastic, and something sickeningly sweet that made your teeth ache. The main floor was a maze of rusted barrels, some still weeping unknown chemicals onto concrete so stained it looked like modern art. We worked methodically, cataloging hazards, taking samples, mapping contamination zones. Every day brought new nightmares: asbestos in the walls, lead paint so thick it peeled off in sheets, mercury pooled in low spots like silver blood. The basement was worse, flooded with 2 feet of water that tested positive for everything the EPA had a limit for, and several things they didn't. By the end of the second week, we'd burned through almost $1 million of the cleanup fund just on safety equipment and waste transport. Holbrook's prediction was starting to look optimistic. "Marcus," Sarah said one evening, finding me at the kitchen table, surrounded by contamination reports and cost projections. "The kids are asking why you're never home anymore." I looked up at her, seeing the worry lines that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "I'm doing this for them, for us." "Are you? Or are you doing it to prove something?" I didn't have a good answer. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was neither. All I knew was that I'd grabbed the barbed wire lifeline, and now I had to climb. The breakthrough came, ironically, from a mistake. We were 3 weeks into cleanup when James called me from the warehouse, his voice strange over the radio. "Boss, you need to see this. Bring the good camera." I found him in the northeast corner of the building, where we'd been removing a particularly nasty collection of chemical drums. One had been heavier than expected, and when they'd moved it, the forklift had punched through what we'd thought was solid concrete floor. "Look," James said, shining his flashlight into the hole. Instead of dirt or more concrete, the light revealed metal, a surface that looked suspiciously like a door. "Is that?" "A hatch," James confirmed. "Probably an old sub-basement. Wasn't on any of the blueprints." My first thought was, great, more contamination to clean. My second thought was, why wasn't this on the blueprints? We spent the rest of the day carefully excavating around the hatch. It was massive, 8 feet square, made of steel that had somehow resisted decades of chemical assault. No rust, no corrosion. just smooth metal with what looked like a combination lock built into the surface. "That's not 1,920 seconds construction," observed Paula, our hazmat specialist. "That steel looks modern, specialized." I ran my gloved hand over the surface, feeling the quality of the metalwork. This wasn't standard industrial construction. This was something else. "Can we open it?" I asked. "Shouldn't we report this to the city first?" James suggested. I thought about it. The smart move was to call it in, let the bureaucrats handle it. But something about the hatch called to me. The same instinct that had made me bid $1,001 whispered that this was important. "Let's at least see if we can get it open," I decided. "Document everything. If there's anything dangerous, we seal it back up and call it in." The lock was a puzzle, no keyhole, just a series of numbered dials set into the steel. We tried obvious combinations: the building's address, the year it was built, anything connected to Brennan Industries. Nothing worked. It was Emma, my daughter, who cracked it. She'd stop by the site after school, something she did occasionally to bring me dinner when I worked late. While I explained the situation, she studied the lock with the focus that would eventually get her into MIT. "Dad, what's weird about this lock?" "Everything?" I suggested. "No, look, it has 8 dials, but they go from 0 to 12, not 0 to 9. That's not random." She was right. Each dial had 13 positions, numbered 0 through 12. "So?" James asked. "So it's not meant for a normal number. It's meant for something with 12s. Like months?" I breathed. "It's meant for dates." Emma nodded, already thinking. 8 dials, so 4 pairs. Month and day, repeated twice. But what dates? We tried every significant date we could think of related to the building, the company, the owners. Nothing. Then Paula, who'd been reviewing the contamination reports, looked up suddenly. "Try 1215, 1215. "Why?" I asked. "December 15th. It appears in 3 different inspection reports as the date Brennan Industries always scheduled their equipment maintenance. Except the inspectors noted they could never actually access the building on those dates. Company holiday, they were told. I spun the dials. 1215, 1215. The lock clicked. We all stepped back as I gripped the handle. 3 weeks of toxic cleanup had prepared us for a lot, but none of us were ready for what lay beneath that hatch. The steel door swung up on hidden counterweights, smooth as silk despite decades of disuse. Our flashlights revealed a staircase descending into darkness, but these weren't rough industrial steps. They were polished granite, edges still sharp, walls lined with what looked like marble. "What the hell?" James whispered. The air coming up from below was wrong. Not chemically wrong, our meters showed it was actually cleaner than the warehouse air. But it was wrong in a different way. Too clean, too preserved, like opening a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. "I'll go first," I said, ignoring the chorus of protests. "The rest of you stay here. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, seal it up and call the police." The stairs descended 20 feet, ending at another door. This one was more modern steel with a small window set at eye level. Through the glass, I could see only darkness. I pushed it open. Motion sensors triggered, and suddenly I was standing in a gallery. That's the only word that fit. The space was enormous, maybe 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, with a 15-foot ceiling. The walls were covered in dark fabric, and along them, barely visible in the indirect lighting that had just activated, hung paintings. Dozens of paintings. I moved into the room like a sleepwalker, my hazmat suit suddenly feeling ridiculous in this pristine space. The paintings were museum quality. I knew that instinctively, even though art had never been my thing. Oil paintings in ornate frames, portraits and landscapes, and abstract pieces that seemed to pulse with life, even in the dim light. A nameplate caught my eye. Portrait of a lady in blue. It read, Johannes Vermeer, c. 1665. Vermeer. Even I knew that name. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, Googling frantically. Portrait of a lady in blue Vermeer brought up a Wikipedia page that made my blood run cold. Stolen from the Gardner Museum, Boston, the 18th of March, 1990. Estimated value, $200 million. Current whereabouts, unknown. I was standing 3 feet from one of the most famous stolen paintings in history. My flashlight swept the room, picking out more nameplates. Rembrandt, Monet, Degas, names that belonged in textbooks and museum halls, not in a hidden vault beneath a toxic waste site in Chicago. In the center of the room stood a desk, papers still spread across its surface, as if someone had just stepped out. I approached carefully, half expecting alarms or booby traps. But there was only silence and the weight of decades. The papers were records, detailed, meticulous records of acquisitions, each painting logged with date of procurement, previous location, and estimated value. The most recent entry was dated the 15th of December, 1987, the day Brennan Industries had been shut down. What happens next will turn this discovery upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the most toxic places hide the most valuable secrets. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. I stood in that vault for maybe 5 minutes before my radio crackled to life. "Boss, you okay down there?" "James," I managed to say, "call Sarah. Tell her to come immediately and bring a lawyer." "A lawyer? Boss, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said, staring at a Rembrandt that had been missing for 40 years. "Everything's wrong. Just get everyone down here and start documenting everything, every single thing." As my team descended into the vault, their reactions ranged from stunned silence to outright disbelief. Paula, who had a minor in art history, actually fell to her knees in front of a Caravaggio that had supposedly been destroyed in World War II. "This is impossible," she whispered. "The martyrdom of Street Sebastian. It was confirmed destroyed in the Dresden bombing. There are photos of the ruins." "Apparently not," I said, reading from the acquisition log. "Says here it was retrieved from private collection, Berlin, 1946. Someone knew it survived and grabbed it." "Marcus," James said slowly, "do you have any idea what we're standing in? This isn't just art theft. This is history. These are things the world thinks are gone forever." I knew. The weight of it was crushing. We'd come to clean up chemical waste and stumbled into what might be the greatest art find in modern history. The legal implications alone made my head spin. Sarah arrived within an hour, along with Tom Harrison, a lawyer friend who specialized in property law. Tom took one look around the vault and immediately made 3 phone calls. To his partner who handled criminal law, to a contact at the FBI, and to his wife to tell her he wouldn't be home for dinner, or possibly for the next several weeks. "Nobody touches anything else," Tom commanded. "This is a crime scene. Technically, it's been a crime scene for 30-plus years, but it's about to become a very active one." "But I own the building," I protested. "The city gave me clear title." "You own the building," Tom agreed. "Whether you own what's in it is going to be a very complicated question. But, Marcus, complicated in this case probably means very, very valuable." The FBI arrived at dawn, a full team that swept in like they'd been preparing for this exact scenario. Special Agent Diana Foster, a woman who looked like she could stare down a statue, took charge immediately. "Mr. Chin," she said, after her initial survey of the vault, "I need you to understand something. What you found here represents active cases in 12 countries. There are insurance companies that have paid out hundreds of millions in claims for these pieces. There are museums that have empty frames on their walls. There are families who've been fighting for decades to recover their heritage." "I understand," I said, though I wasn't sure I did. The scope kept expanding every time someone new looked at the collection. "Do you?" she pressed. "Because in about 6 hours, this is going to be international news. Your face, your name, your company, everything is about to be under a microscope. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Sarah and the kids, about my crew who'd stumbled into this with me, about the quiet life I'd built and was about to lose. "No," I admitted, "but it's too late to close the door now." Agent Foster smiled for the first time, a thin expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Good. Honesty will help. Now, let's talk about how this is going to work." The process was methodical and overwhelming. Each painting had to be photographed, cataloged, and verified. Experts flew in from around the world, curators, authentication specialists, insurance investigators. The warehouse became a circus of activity, with the toxic cleanup on the upper levels continuing, while the subterranean treasure trove was slowly, carefully documented. The media found out on day 3, someone we never figured out who leaked a photo of the Gardner Museum's Vermeer being carefully lifted from the vault. By sunset, there were news vans lined up outside the fence, reporters shouting questions, and helicopters circling overhead like mechanical vultures. Mr. Chen, how does it feel to find $450 million in stolen art? Marcus, are you planning to claim ownership? Is it true there are pieces here that were looted by the Nazis? Tom hired a public relations firm to handle the media, but there was no containing the story. The Toxic Temple had become the world's most unlikely art gallery, and I was its accidental curator. The legal battles started immediately. Insurance companies that had paid out claims decades ago suddenly wanted their money's worth. Museums argued for the return of cultural patrimony. Private collectors who'd had pieces stolen came forward with documentation, and overarching all of it was the question: who had assembled this collection and how? The answer came from the records in the vault, cross-referenced with FBI files and international databases. The collection was the life's work of a man named Alexander Brennan, born Alexander Brinovich in Russia, immigrated to the U.S. In 1946, anglicized his name, and built a chemical empire that was apparently a front for the world's most successful art theft ring. He was brilliant, Agent Foster admitted grudgingly as we reviewed the evidence. The chemical business gave him reasons to travel internationally, to ship large containers without scrutiny, to have warehouses and storage facilities. When the EPA shut him down, he was days away from moving the collection again. But why keep them hidden? I asked. Why not sell them? Because he wasn't a thief for profit, she explained. He was a collector. Look at these records he writes about the paintings, like they're his children. He couldn't bear to sell them, couldn't display them without revealing his crimes. So he built this vault and visited them in secret. Like a dragon with its hoard, Sarah murmured. She'd been spending more time at the warehouse, fascinated by the unfolding mystery. Exactly like that, Foster agreed. And like a dragon, he'd rather have died than give them up. Which, apparently, he did. Heart attack, the 20th of December, 1987. 5 days after the EPA raid. His secrets died with him. The cleanup of the warehouse continued above us, a strange counterpoint to the delicate art recovery below. My crews worked in hazmat suits to remove decades of chemical contamination while just beneath their feet, conservators in white gloves handled priceless masterpieces. The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone. We were simultaneously dealing with humanity's worst industrial sins and its greatest artistic achievements. By the end of the first month, we'd cataloged 47 paintings with a combined estimated value of over $450 million. There was also a smaller room we discovered behind a false wall, containing sculptures, rare manuscripts, and what appeared to be an entire Byzantine mosaic that had been carefully disassembled and packed for transport. The legal ownership question became a Gordian knot that would take years to fully untangle. Tom assembled a team of lawyers who specialized in art law, international property rights, and something called adverse possession that I'd never heard of but apparently mattered a great deal. Here's the situation, Tom explained during one of our marathon legal strategy sessions. You legally own the building and everything in it that's clear from the city transfer. But stolen property typically remains stolen property no matter how many times it changes hands. However, there are statutes of limitations, questions of abandonment, and the fact that many of the original owners are dead or dissolved. So what happens? I asked. Best case? The courts decide you're entitled to a finder's fee from the various claimants, museums, insurance companies, private collectors. That could be substantial. We're talking maybe 10–15% of the recovered value. Worst case? You get a pat on the back and a footnote in art history books. As it turned out, we landed somewhere in between. The first settlement came from the Gardner Museum, eager to recover their Vermeer and willing to pay a significant reward for its return. Other institutions followed suit, and suddenly my struggling environmental cleanup company had a 7-figure cushion that seemed surreal. But more important than the money was what the discovery did for Millbrook, my adopted home. The tiny town became a pilgrimage site for art lovers and curiosity seekers. Dorothy May's diner saw lines out the door. The motel couldn't keep up with booking requests. The local museum, which had been surviving on a shoestring budget, received donations from around the world and was able to expand into a proper cultural center. And the warehouse itself? Once we finished the cleanup, which took another 2 years and every penny of that $5 million fund, I had a decision to make. Developers were circling, offering astronomical sums for the land. The smart money move was to sell, take the profit, and walk away from the strange chapter of my life that had started with a $1,001 bid. Instead, I did something else. The warehouse transformation began with a simple idea from Emma, who was home from college for winter break. We were standing in the now decontaminated main floor, looking at the soaring ceilings and industrial bones of the structure. "You know what this reminds me of?" she said. "The Tate Modern in London. It used to be a power station." "This was a toxic waste site," I reminded her. "Was," she emphasized. "Now it's a blank canvas. Dad, you've got this incredible space, international attention, and a direct connection to one of the biggest art stories of the century. What if instead of selling to developers, you created something that honors both parts of the story? Like what? A museum, not just for the found art that's all being returned anyway, but a museum about the whole story. The industrial history, the environmental damage, the cleanup process, and yes, the discovery. Call it the Museum of Hidden Histories or something." Sarah, who'd been sketching in her notebook a habit she developed during the long days at the warehouse, looked up. "That's actually brilliant. Show people how the worst places can be transformed, how secrets get buried and found, how art survives even in the most unlikely circumstances." I looked around the space with new eyes. The north wall, where we'd found the worst contamination, could house displays about industrial pollution and cleanup techniques. The vault entrance could be preserved as it was discovered, letting visitors descend into a recreation of that first moment of discovery. The main floor had enough space for rotating exhibitions, educational programs, maybe even artist residencies. "It would cost a fortune," I said, but I was already calculating, planning, imagining. "You have a fortune," Tom pointed out. "The finder's fees alone are approaching $15 million, and that's just from the settlements completed so far. Plus, I've been fielding calls from philanthropists who want to be associated with this story. The Hewlett Foundation is interested. The Getty. Major players who see the narrative value in what you've accomplished here." The decision crystallized in that moment. The warehouse had been many things: a paint factory, a chemical dump, a secret vault, a crime scene. Now it would be something else, a testament to transformation. The next 2 years were a whirlwind of construction, negotiation, and discovery. We hired Rosa Martinez, a renowned museum designer who'd worked on projects around the world. She understood immediately what we were trying to create. "It's not just about displaying artifacts," she said during our first planning meeting. "It's about telling intersecting stories. The industrial story, the environmental story, the art story, and ultimately the human story of how all these elements came together." We preserved as much of the original structure as possible. The steel beams that had supported chemical tanks now supported elevated walkways. The loading docks became entrance portals. The vault remained exactly as we'd found it, though now climate-controlled and properly lit, with reproductions of the discovered artworks in their original positions. The process wasn't without complications. Some community members opposed glorifying a site of environmental crimes. Former Brennan Industries workers came forward with stories of illegal dumping they'd been forced to participate in, adding dark chapters to our narrative. We incorporated it all, refusing to whitewash the history. "You can't have redemption without acknowledging the sins," Rosa said, and it became our unofficial motto. The legal battles continued even as construction progressed. A particularly complex case involved a Monet that had been stolen from a Jewish family in Paris in 1941. Their descendants, scattered across 3 continents, had to be located and agreements negotiated. Each painting had its own story of loss and recovery, and we decided to make those stories part of the exhibition. My crew, the men who'd suited up in hazmat gear and descended into toxic hell with me, became unexpected partners in the museum project. James supervised the construction, his knowledge of the building's every corner invaluable. Paula, with her art history background, joined the curatorial team. Even our Hazmat gear found its way into the exhibition, displayed alongside Renaissance paintings to show the strange journey of discovery. The financial complexity grew beyond anything I could have imagined. Tom brought in specialists in nonprofit law, and we established the Brennan Warehouse Foundation with a mission to educate about industrial history, environmental responsibility, and art preservation. Major donations flowed in, particularly after a 60-minute segment that featured our story. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Holbrook, the demolition contractor I'd outbid, filed a lawsuit claiming I'd had insider information about the vault. It was baseless. Nobody had known about the art, but it dragged through courts for months before being dismissed. There were also attempts to rob the site during construction, protests from radical environmental groups who thought we were glorifying pollution, and constant media scrutiny that made normal life impossible. I signed up to be married to a contractor, not a celebrity. Sarah told me one evening after a particularly intrusive photographer had followed our family to dinner. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "I never imagined." "I know," she interrupted, "and I'm not really complaining. It's just adjustment. The kids are handling it better than I am, honestly." Indeed, Emma had become something of a spokesperson for the project. Her combination of youth, intelligence, and direct connection to the story making her a media favorite. She started a blog about the warehouse transformation that gained hundreds of thousands of followers, documenting not just the big moments, but the daily progress, the setbacks, the small victories. "Dad's not trying to be a hero," she wrote in one post that went viral. "He's just a guy who bought a toxic warehouse and tried to clean it up. The art was an accident. The museum is a choice. There's a difference." The discovery also changed our relationship with Millbrook. The town that had taken us in during our darkest moment now found itself in the international spotlight. Tour buses arrived daily, property values increased, new businesses opened to cater to visitors. The economic impact was transformative, but also disruptive. Dorothy May, ever practical, expanded her diner and hired more staff but refused to change her menu or raise prices for locals. "I'm not going to price out the people who kept me in business all these years just because we're famous now," she declared. Frank, who'd been instrumental in bringing us to Millbrook, became an unofficial town historian, giving tours that wove together the warehouse story with broader local history. His mother, despite her advancing dementia, seemed to brighten during these storytelling sessions, sometimes adding details about the town's past that nobody else remembered. The Art World connections opened unexpected doors. I found myself invited to gallery openings, museum galas, and cultural conferences. A kid from Chicago's South Side who'd started a cleanup company with borrowed money was suddenly discussing preservation techniques with curators from the Louvre. One particularly surreal evening, I sat at a fundraising dinner between a billionaire collector and a famous artist whose work sold for millions. They peppered me with questions about the discovery, the moment of realization, the feeling of standing among masterpieces in a toxic vault. "It must have been like finding Tutankhamun's tomb," the artist suggested. "No," I corrected. "It was like finding Tutankhamun's tomb in a nuclear waste site. The contrast was everything. Beauty in the midst of poison, art surviving where life couldn't. That contrast became central to the museum's design." Visitors would journey through exhibits on industrial Chicago, see the environmental damage caused by decades of chemical processing, learn about modern cleanup techniques, and then descend into the vault to discover how something beautiful had been hidden among the horror. We included interactive elements that Emma suggested, a simulation of hazmat cleanup procedures, a chemistry lab where visitors could test contaminated water, and an art restoration station where they could try their hand at conservation techniques. The goal was to make every visitor part of the story, not just observers. The grand opening was scheduled for exactly 3 years after I'd won the auction. In the weeks leading up to it, I often found myself alone in the museum after hours, walking through the spaces we'd created, remembering the fear and uncertainty of those first days. The vault had been perfectly preserved, but was now accessible to all. We'd installed a glass floor over sections so visitors could see the original structure below. The paintings, all reproductions now, the originals returned to their rightful owners, hung exactly as Alexander Brennan had placed them, each with a plaque telling its story of theft, concealment, and recovery. One evening, Sarah found me sitting on the original desk that still occupied the center of the vault. She sat beside me, our shoulders touching, looking around at the space that had changed our lives. "Any regrets?" she asked. "About the warehouse?" "No." "About what it cost us in privacy and normal life?" "Sometimes." "The kids are proud of you. I'm proud of you. I just cleaned up a mess and got lucky," I protested. "No," she said firmly. "You took a chance when everyone said you were crazy. You did the right thing when you could have grabbed the money and run. You built something meaningful from something poisonous. That's not luck. That's character." Agent Foster, who'd become an unlikely friend through the years of legal proceedings, attended the opening. She pulled me aside during the reception. "You know, we're still finding pieces from Brennan's network," she said. "Every few months, something surfaces in an auction or estate sale that traces back to his operation. The museum has become a resource for us, a way to understand his methods." "Glad we could help," I said. "It's more than that," she continued. "You've created a template for what to do when we find these hidden collections, not just legally, but ethically. How to balance the claims of ownership with public good. The Brennan Museum model, we're calling it internally." The opening was a success beyond anything we'd imagined. Over 1,000 people attended, including representatives from museums worldwide, environmental activists, art lovers, and locals who just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. The mayor of Chicago cut the ribbon, noting that the city's gamble on selling the toxic site for $1 had paid off in ways nobody could have predicted. But the moment that stayed with me was quieter. It came after the crowds had gone, when just family and close friends remained. Ivy and Finn, Jasper's children who'd become regular visitors, were racing through the exhibits with the fearlessness of youth. Dorothy May was explaining to Frank's mother how she'd known I was the right person for the warehouse from the moment I'd walked into her diner. I stood with Emma, watching her little cousins play among millions of dollars worth of art reproductions in a former toxic waste site. "You did good, Dad," she said simply. "We all did," I replied, and meant it. The warehouse had been transformed not by one person, but by a community of people who'd seen possibility where others saw only problems. As the evening wound down and we prepared to lock up the museum for the night, I made one last walk through the exhibits. From the industrial history section with its stark black and white photographs to the environmental remediation display with its hopeful message of restoration, from the crime story of Brennan's theft ring to the triumph of art's recovery, it all told a single narrative about the complexity of human achievement and failure, creation and destruction, poison and beauty. The warehouse stood as proof that the worst places could hide the best surprises, that toxic ground could be reclaimed, and that sometimes bidding $1,001 on a derelict building could change not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. Outside, the Chicago skyline glittered in the distance, the city that had produced both the industrial poison and the industrial wealth that created our strange story. The museum would open to the public tomorrow, beginning its new life as an educational center, a community gathering place, and a reminder that transformation was always possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. I locked the door, set the alarm, and walked to my car where Sarah waited. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Running a museum was different from running a cleanup company, but tonight, we'd celebrate the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "Ready to go home?" Sarah asked as I slid into the passenger seat. "Yeah," I said, taking one last look at the building that had changed everything. "Let's go home." The drive back to Millbrook was quiet, both of us lost in thought about the journey that had brought us here. 3 years ago, I'd been a desperate contractor making a desperate bid. Now I was a museum founder, an accidental art expert, and a man who'd learned that sometimes the most toxic investments could yield the most beautiful returns. As we crossed into Millbrook, the familiar sights welcomed us. Dorothy May's diner with its warm lights, the town square where Frank gave us history tours, the small house we'd bought with the first settlement check. It wasn't the life we'd planned, but it was the life we'd built from the strange gift of a poisoned warehouse and the courage to bid $1 more than seemed sensible. The museum would tell its stories to thousands of visitors in the years to come. But for those of us who'd lived it, who'd suited up in hazmat gear and descended into the unknown, who'd fought legal battles and construction delays and public scrutiny, The real story was simpler. Sometimes you have to clear away the poison to find the beauty underneath, and sometimes the clearing itself becomes the most beautiful part of all. The call came at 5:47 a.m. on a rain-soaked Tuesday, 6 months after the museum's grand opening. I'd been in the warehouse since 4:30, my old contractor habits dying hard, checking the humidity controls in the vault exhibition. The maintenance routine had become a meditation of sorts, a way to connect with the space that had changed everything. Marcus Chen? The voice was elderly, accented with traces of Eastern Europe. My name is Victor Kaplan. I believe you found something that belonged to my employer. The museum opens at 10, I said automatically, then registered the oddness of the call. Wait, who was your employer? Alexander Brinovich. You knew him as Brennan. I worked for him for 43 years, Mr. Chen. I helped build what you found. My hand tightened on the phone. In 6 months of operation, we'd had false confessions, conspiracy theorists, and people claiming to be Brennan's lost relatives. But something in this voice, tired, resigned, carrying the weight of decades, seemed different. If you're who you say you are, the FBI will want to talk to you. A dry laugh. I'm 91 years old, Mr. Chen. I have perhaps months left. The FBI can wait. But there are things you should know. Things about the warehouse, about what you haven't found yet. What haven't we found? The second vault, of course. Did you think a man like Alexander would put all his treasures in one basket? The phone went dead. I stood in the climate-controlled preservation of the vault exhibit, surrounded by reproductions of masterpieces, feeling the familiar chill that came with each new revelation about this place. We'd been operating for 6 months, welcoming thousands of visitors, winning architecture awards for the transformation. I'd started to believe we'd uncovered all the warehouse's secrets. Sarah found me there an hour later, still staring at my phone. You missed breakfast, she said, then saw my expression. What's wrong? I told her about the call. She listened with the patient attention that had carried us through 3 years of insanity. From the discovery, to the construction, to the daily challenge of running a museum neither of us had trained for. It could be a hoax, she said finally. Could be, I agreed. But what if it's not? Then we call Agent Foster and let the professionals handle it. It was the sensible response. The mature, responsible reaction of people who'd already had their lives turned upside down once and had no desire to repeat the experience. But as I looked around the vault at the desk where Brennan had cataloged his stolen treasures, at the paintings hung exactly as he'd left them, I felt the old curiosity stirring. He said months to live, I murmured. What if he dies before we find out what he knows? Sarah sighed, recognizing the tone. You're going to investigate this yourself, aren't you? Just a little research. If anything substantial turns up, I'll call Foster immediately. Famous last words, she muttered, but kissed my cheek. Try not to. Discover any more international crime rings before lunch. We have the school tour at 1. Victor Kaplan proved surprisingly easy to find. A few hours of searching revealed a man of his name and age living in a nursing home in Cicero, a Chicago suburb that had seen better days. His background checked out immigration records from 1,947, employment history with various Brennan companies. No criminal record beyond a few parking tickets. I called Agent Foster anyway, leaving a voicemail about the contact. Then, because patience had never been my strong suit, I drove to Cicero. The Sunset Gardens care facility was neither sunny nor garden-like. It squatted on a corner lot between a defunct strip mall and a check-cashing place, all brick and small windows and the particular sadness of places where people go to wait. Victor Kaplan's room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the parking lot. I found him in a wheelchair by the window, a blanket across his lap despite the warm September day. He was smaller than I'd expected, shrunken by age, but with eyes that remained sharp behind thick glasses. Mr. Chen, he said without turning. I wondered if you would come. How did you know it was me? Who else would it be? My children are dead. My grandchildren don't know I exist. You're the only person in the world who might care what an old man knows about Alexander Brinovich. I pulled up a visitor's chair, its vinyl creaking. Tell me about the second vault. First, tell me about the first. The newspapers were vague. How much did you really find? I hesitated, but something about his frailty, the sparse room with its single photo of a long-dead wife, made deception seem cruel. I told him about the 47 paintings, the manuscripts, the Byzantine mosaic. His eyes closed as I spoke, and I thought he might have fallen asleep until he murmured a name. The Vermeer. He loved that one most, said the lady in blue reminded him of his sister left behind in Russia. You helped. Steal them? Steal! His eyes snapped open. Is it stealing to rescue art from those who don't deserve it? The Gardner Museum, do you know they had that Vermeer in storage? Not even displayed. Alexander gave it a home, visited it every week. He gave it a tomb, I countered, hidden in the dark for decades. Better darkness than destruction. Better hidden than sold to private collectors who would lock it away forever. He shifted in his chair, blanket sliding to reveal legs thin as bird bones. But you're right, of course. It was stealing. I've had 50 years to make peace with that. Tell me about the second vault. Impatient, like Alexander. Very well. He gestured to a glass of water on the bedside table. I handed it to him, waiting while he sipped through a straw. The warehouse at 4557 South Paulina, you know it had sub-basements. You found one. But Chicago is a city built on swamps. Mr. Chen, every building of that era has secrets beneath. Alexander bought the warehouse specifically because of what previous owners had built underground. What previous owners? Prohibition. The word carried weight. Decades of hidden history. The warehouse was a distribution center for Canadian whiskey. Tunnels connected it to speakeasies across the South Side. When Prohibition ended, the tunnels were sealed, forgotten, until Alexander found the old blueprints. My mind raced, imagining the warehouse as a hub of 1,922nd's criminal enterprise. It made sense, the industrial facade hiding smuggling operations, the strategic location near rail lines and water routes. He converted one tunnel into his second vault, Victor continued. The first was for pieces he'd visit, admire, show to very select guests. The second was for overflow, items awaiting restoration, pieces too hot to display, and, he paused, seeming to wrestle with decades-old loyalty, and his special collection. The pieces he acquired not for beauty, but for leverage. Leverage? Alexander understood. That art was power. A stolen painting could be many things, a beautiful object, certainly, but also blackmail material if the right person wanted it badly enough. Evidence of crime if needed, currency in circles where money meant nothing. He was blackmailing people? Not actively. Think of it as insurance. Files on where each piece came from, who helped acquire it, which museum directors looked the other way, which collectors bought items they knew were stolen, all stored with the special collection as protection. The implications made my stomach turn. We'd portrayed Brennan as an obsessed collector in our museum narrative. This painted him as something darker, a criminal mastermind using beauty as a weapon. Where's the entrance to this second vault? Victor smiled, revealing teeth too perfect to be original. First, understand what you're asking. The second vault isn't like the first. No climate control, no careful preservation, 50 years of Chicago weather, seeping water, rats. If anything survives, it will be damaged. Where? I repeated. The northwest corner of the main floor. What did you install there? I thought back to our construction plans. The education center, children's workshop space. How appropriate. Look for a brass plate in the floor, probably covered by your new flooring. It will say Chicago Municipal Water District. It's fake. Alexander had it made to discourage investigation. Beneath it, a ladder descending to the tunnel. Why are you telling me this? He turned from the window then, studying me with those sharp eyes. I read about your museum, what you've done with Alexander's legacy. He would have hated it, the exposure, the return of his treasures, the public trampling through his sanctuary. But perhaps that's why it feels right. Time to drag all secrets into the light. Or you could be sending me into a death trap. True, he seemed amused by the possibility. But you'll go anyway. You're like him in that way. The curiosity is stronger than the caution. I wanted to deny it, but we both knew he was right. I'd been planning the exploration since he'd mentioned the brass plate. One more thing, Victor said as I stood to leave. The special collection included items beyond paintings, documents, photographs, recordings. If they survived, you'll face a choice. Some secrets are better left buried, Mr. Chen. The people in those files, many are dead, but their children, grandchildren, live on. Revelation could destroy innocent lives. I'll handle it responsibly. Will you, even if one of those files contains information about your own family? I froze at the door. What? But Victor had closed his eyes, dismissing me with the imperious gesture of someone who'd said all they intended to say. The drive back to the museum passed in a blur of speculation. My family had no connection to Chicago crime, no history that would intersect with Brennan's world. Victor was playing games, adding drama to ensure I'd investigate. It had to be manipulation, but the seed was planted. I arrived to find the museum bustling with a school group, third graders wide-eyed at the hazmat suit display. Emma was home from MIT for fall break, helping with tours, her enthusiasm infectious as she explained how we'd cleaned thousands of gallons of toxic waste. And then my dad found the secret door, she told the children, who gasped appreciatively. Like a real-life treasure hunt, except the treasure was hidden under poison. I watched her, thinking about secrets and revelations, about the choices we make to protect the ones we love. Would I want to know if my family harbored dark secrets? Would Emma? That evening, after the museum closed, I gathered my core team in the education center. James, my foreman who'd become facilities manager, Paula, who'd parlayed her hazmat experience and art history minor into a curator position, Tom Harrison, our lawyer who'd shepherded us through 3 years of legal complexity. We might have another vault, I announced, then explained Victor's claims. Tom's expression cycled through skepticism, concern, and resignation. Of course there is, because this story wasn't complicated enough. Question is, James said, already eyeing the floor like he could x-ray through it, do we look? Legally? Tom interjected, you're required to report any credible information about additional stolen artwork to the FBI. I left Foster a voicemail this morning. She hasn't called back. That's not the same as Tom, I interrupted. I'm going to look. The question is whether you all want to be involved. Paula knelt on the floor, running her hands over the seamless surface we'd installed 6 months ago. Here, she said suddenly. There's a slight depression, rectangular, about 2 feet by 3 feet. We moved furniture, rolled back the educational carpet we'd installed over the sealed concrete. James retrieved tools from the maintenance closet. As we worked, I felt the familiar mixture of excitement and dread that had accompanied every discovery in this building. The brass plate was exactly where Victor had described, buried under our new flooring but still visible once we'd cleared away the modern additions. Chicago Municipal Water District was etched in official-looking letters, complete with a seal that would have fooled any casual observer. This is the moment, Tom said, where I remind you that breaking into a potential crime scene without FBI presence could compromise any evidence found and potentially make you liable for, noted, I said, working a pry bar under the plate's edge. Everyone who wants plausible deniability should leave now. Nobody moved. The plate lifted with surprising ease, revealing a square shaft descending into darkness. Metal rungs were bolted to one wall, disappearing beyond our flashlight beams. The smell that rose from below was different from the chemical assault of our original discovery. This was organic. Decay, mildew, and something else. Age, abandonment, secrets left to rot. I'll go first, I said. Like hell, James countered. You're the boss now. Bosses don't go into potentially structurally unsound underground tunnels. That's what facilities managers are for. Before I could argue, he swung onto the ladder, testing each rung before committing his weight. Seems solid, he called up. Definitely pre-war construction, built to last. One by one, we descended. The shaft went down perhaps 20 feet before opening into a tunnel. Brick walls curved overhead, sweating moisture that had probably been seeping since the Hoover administration. Our flashlights revealed a passage maybe 8 feet wide and 7 feet high, extending north into darkness. Prohibition tunnels, Paula breathed. Do you realize what this is? Living history, urban archaeology. We should be documenting every inch. After we find the vault, I said, but I understood her excitement. The tunnel was remarkably intact, brick walls still showing mason's marks, Iron fixtures that once held electrical cables for lights that guided bootleggers through Chicago's underground. We moved carefully, testing the ground with each step. The tunnel had survived 90 years, but that didn't mean it was stable. Water pooled in places, and several sections showed repairs in different materials, evidence of Brennan's modifications. About 100 feet in, the tunnel widened into a junction. 3 passages branched off, but only one showed recent work, a steel door set into a concrete frame, thoroughly modern compared to the surrounding brickwork. "That's our vault," James said unnecessarily. Unlike the first vault's combination lock, this door had a simple padlock now rusted into a solid mass. James produced bolt cutters from his tool bag. I had long ago stopped asking why he carried industrial cutting tools everywhere and made short work of it. The door swung open on hinges that shrieked like movie sound effects. Our flashlights penetrated the darkness beyond, revealing chaos. Where the first vault had been pristine, this was disaster. Water had infiltrated despite Brennan's precautions. Paintings leaned against walls in various stages of decay. Sculptures stood on platforms surrounded by pools of contaminated runoff. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their contents visible through rust holes. "Jesus," Tom muttered. "It's an art graveyard." We entered carefully, documenting everything with our phones. The damage was heartbreaking, but not complete. Some pieces, stored higher or protected by quirks of placement, seemed salvageable. A bronze sculpture appeared intact beneath verdigris. A stack of paintings in a waterproof case might have survived, but it was the filing cabinets that drew my attention. Victor had mentioned documents, leverage, records that could destroy lives. Despite the rust, despite decades of neglect, paper could survive if kept dry. And Brennan, paranoid as he was, would have taken precautions. I opened the least damaged cabinet. Inside, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, were files. Hundreds of files. Each labeled with a name, a date, a reference number that presumably corresponded to items in the collection. "Don't touch those," Tom warned. "Seriously, Marcus, this is evidence in federal crimes. We need to." I was already reading labels. Names I didn't recognize. Some I did. Chicago politicians from the 1962nd, museum directors, private collectors, and there, in a section marked Insurance, a name that made my blood freeze. Chen, William, 1987. Ref, Gardner Transport, William Chen. My father. My hand shook as I pulled the file. Inside, protected by plastic sleeves, were shipping manifests, photographs, and a handwritten note in what I recognized from the first vault as Brennan's careful script. William Chen proved invaluable in the Gardner acquisition. His position with the shipping company allowed modification of manifests without question. Payment made through usual channels. Note: Chen, unaware of ultimate purpose, believes he was facilitating standard gray market antiquities trade. Useful asset for future operations, maintain ignorance of true nature. The words blurred as I read them again. My father, dead 15 years, who I'd thought spent his life as a middle manager at a shipping company, had helped transport the stolen Gardner Museum paintings. Unknowingly, according to Brennan, but involved nonetheless. "Marcus?" Paula's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You okay?" I handed her the file wordlessly. She read it, her expression shifting from curiosity to horror to sympathy. "He didn't know," she said firmly. "It says right here he thought it was standard antiquities, maybe technically illegal, but not this." "Does it matter?" I asked. "My father helped steal some of the most famous paintings in history. I found them. I returned them. I built a museum on the profits." I laughed, the sound bitter in the moldering vault. Victor was right. Some secrets should stay buried. "No," Tom said, reading over Paula's shoulder. "This actually explains something that puzzled the FBI, how Brennan moved the painting so quickly after the Gardner theft. Your father wasn't a criminal, Marcus. He was a guy doing side work who got manipulated by a master criminal." I wanted to believe it. The note did suggest my father's ignorance. But doubt crept in. Had he really not suspected? Had he chosen not to know? And what did it mean that I'd accidentally uncovered and profited from crimes he'd unknowingly aided? "We need to document everything and get out," James said practically. This structure isn't stable, and we've been down here too long. Save the existential crisis for above ground." He was right. We spent another hour photographing everything, creating a rough inventory of what remained in the second vault. The art was mostly beyond saving water, and time had done what the chemicals upstairs hadn't. But the files were largely intact, a treasure trove of information about decades of art crime. We emerged from the education center floor like miners returning from a deep shaft, filthy and exhausted and burdened with knowledge we weren't sure we wanted. I secured the brass plate and we agreed to meet the next morning to decide our next steps. But I couldn't go home. Not yet. I sent Sarah a text about working late and retreated to my museum office, a space carved out of what had been Brennan's administrative center. I spread my father's file across the desk and read every document by lamplight. The story emerged in shipping records and careful notes. William Chen, logistics coordinator for Fairweather Shipping, had been approached in 1989 about moving delicate artwork with customs complications. The pay was extraordinary, more than his annual salary for a few nights' work. He'd modified manifests, arranged for containers to bypass normal inspections, ensured certain crates were loaded onto specific trucks. All the paperwork looked legitimate. As far as my father knew, he was helping wealthy collectors avoid import taxes, not receiving stolen masterpieces. Brennan's notes praised his efficiency and recommended him for future operations, though apparently those never materialized. My father left Fairweather Shipping in 1991, moving to a different company where he worked until retirement. I remembered him as quiet, hardworking, proud of putting 2 kids through college on a middle manager's salary. He died of a heart attack 3 years before I bought the warehouse. What would he think of his son accidentally completing the circle he'd unknowingly started? A knock interrupted my brooding. Agent Foster stood in the doorway, looking tired and unsurprised. "Got your voicemail?" she said. "Also got a call from Tom Harrison an hour ago. Said you'd found something I should see immediately." "Tom called you? He's a good lawyer. Knows when. His client needs protection from their own discoveries." She entered the office, noting the spread files. "Is that what I think it is?" I nodded. Victor Kaplan was telling the truth. There's a second vault. It's full of damaged art and intact files documenting decades of crimes. I hesitated, then pushed my father's file across the desk, including this. Foster read it with professional detachment, occasionally making notes in a small pad. When she finished, she looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. "This must be difficult to process. Is it evidence? Will it be public?" "It's evidence, yes. Part of a larger pattern we've been piecing together about Brennan's network." She paused, choosing words carefully. "As for public disclosure, that depends. Your father appears to have been what we call an unwitting facilitator, used but not complicit. Those names often remain sealed to protect innocent families. Often, I can't make promises. But I can note in my report that William Chen appeared to be unaware of the true nature of the shipments, that he left the shipping industry shortly after, that his son voluntarily provided this information. She studied me. That last part matters, Marcus. You could have destroyed this file. No one would have known. I would have known." "Yes," she agreed. "You would have." The next hours blurred together. Foster's team arrived, sealing off the education center and beginning the careful process of documenting the second vault. I answered questions, provided context, watched my museum transform once again into a crime scene. By dawn, the scope was becoming clear. The damaged artworks, while mostly unsalvageable, included pieces from thefts spanning 40 years. The files were a roadmap to an entire network of art crime, implicating dozens of people across multiple countries. Most were dead, but some weren't. Foster warned me that the investigation would take years and would likely make headlines again. "The museum will be in the spotlight," she said. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the school children who visited daily, learning about art and chemistry and the complexity of human nature, about the community programs we'd started, about the message we'd crafted about redemption and transformation. "We'll manage," I said. Sarah arrived as Foster's team was loading evidence vans. She took one look at my expression and pulled me into a hug. "Tom called. Told me about your father." I don't know how to process it, I admitted against her shoulder. He helped steal the paintings I found. It's like the universe is playing some cosmic joke. Or, she said, pulling back to look at me, it's like the universe gave you a chance to make something right. Your father unknowingly helped hide those paintings. You found them and returned them. That's not a joke. That's justice. Poetic justice, I muttered. The best kind, she said firmly. Emma arrived soon after, having heard the commotion. Her reaction to the revelation about her grandfather was typically direct. So Grandpa accidentally helped steal paintings, and you accidentally found them? That's actually kind of amazing. Like, what are the odds? You're not upset? Why? Grandpa didn't know what he was doing, and even if he did suspect something, he stopped. He got out. That matters. She looked around at the FBI vehicles, the evidence being removed. Plus, now you've got an even better story for the museum. Personal connection to the crimes, redemption across generations. People eat that up. Emma, Sarah chided, this isn't about marketing. Everything's about marketing, Mom. The question is what story we choose to tell. Her pragmatism, while slightly callous, held truth. The museum would need to address this new revelation, incorporate it into our narrative. We could hide it, hope it remained buried in FBI files. Or we could own it, make it part of the larger story about how good can emerge from bad. How? The sons can sometimes atone for the sins of the fathers, even when those fathers didn't know they were sinning. The local news picked up the story by afternoon. New discovery at Brennan Warehouse Museum's second vault found. The coverage was breathless, focusing on the dramatic discovery and FBI involvement. But it was the Tribune's in-depth piece 3 days later that really captured the impact. The discovery of a second vault at the Brennan Warehouse Museum adds new chapters to an already remarkable story. Among the revelations, dozens of previously unknown art thefts, a network of unwitting accomplices, and a personal connection that museum founder Marcus Chin calls devastating but necessary to confront. Chin's father, William, appears in the recovered files as someone who unknowingly aided in transporting stolen Gardner Museum pieces in 1990. The revelation adds a deeply personal dimension to Chin's discovery and subsequent return of those same paintings. The article was fair, noting my father's apparent ignorance and my voluntary disclosure. But seeing our family name in print, connected to international art theft, felt like a punch to the gut. The community response surprised me. Dorothy May was the first to visit, bringing a peach cobbler and stern words. "You listen to me, Marcus Chen," she said. "Your father made a mistake. Maybe he knew, maybe he didn't. Doesn't matter. What matters is what you did when you found out. You could have buried it, protected his memory and your reputation. Instead, you chose truth. That's character." Frank came by with similar sentiments. "In Vietnam, I learned that sometimes good people do bad things, and bad people do good things. World's not as black and white as we'd like. Your dad was human. You're human. The warehouse is proof that even the worst mistakes can be transformed into something valuable." Even Victor Kaplan, when I visited him again to tell him about the discovery, seemed philosophical about the personal revelation. Alexander would have been amused, he said, the son undoing the father's work, then discovering the connection. He believed in fate, you know, thought the universe had patterns we couldn't see but could sometimes sense. Do you believe that? I believe, Victor said slowly, that we all have secrets. Things done in darkness that we hope never see light. Your father's secret is now illuminated. The question is, does it change who he was to you? I thought about it during the drive back, during sleepless nights, during meetings, about how to address this in our museum narrative. Who was William Chin? A man who'd worked hard, loved his family, and made one significant error in judgment that haunted no one during his lifetime, but now echoed through mine. In the end, we decided on transparency. The museum created a new exhibit about the second vault discovery, including a section on the network of people Brennan had used. We told my father's story anonymized as Shipping Coordinator WC to protect living relatives while maintaining honesty about the connection. The exhibit opening drew massive crowds. People were fascinated by the layers of story, crime upon crime, discovery upon discovery, revelation upon revelation. But what resonated most, based on comment cards and feedback, was the human element. The guard who looked the other way, the secretary who didn't ask questions, the shipping coordinator who modified manifests. Ordinary people making choices that seemed small but contributed to something larger. It makes you think, one visitor wrote. What compromises do we make daily? What do we choose not to see? 6 months after the second vault discovery, we held a special event. Using new technology, conservators had managed to restore 3 paintings from the water-damaged collection. They would be returned to their rightful owners, but first, they would be displayed for 1 week in the museum, a resurrection story to complement our narrative of transformation. The opening was smaller than our grand opening 3 years ago. Family, close friends, the core team who'd lived through both discoveries. Victor Kaplan attended in a wheelchair, his health failing but his mind still sharp. Agent Foster came, having become an unlikely friend through years of investigation. Even Holbrook showed up, the demolition contractor I'd outbid, now a supporter who donated to our education programs. You know, he said, shaking my hand. I'm glad you got it for $1,001. I would have torn it all down, would have missed all this. As the evening progressed, I found myself in the first vault, now perfectly climate-controlled and filled with reproduction paintings exactly as Brennan had hung them. The desk still sat in the center, his ledgers displayed under glass, documenting obsession and crime and the strange beauty that emerged from both. Emma joined me, now in her senior year at MIT, having switched her major to museum studies with a focus on conservation science. The warehouse had changed her trajectory as much as mine. No regrets? She asked, echoing her mother's question from 3 years ago. About the warehouse? No. About what we found? Sometimes. About what we've built from it? Never. Even the part about Grandpa? Especially that part, I said after consideration. It reminds me that we're all capable of compromise, that good people can make bad choices, that redemption sometimes takes generations. She nodded, understanding in a way that made me proud. So, what's next? We've found 2 vaults, returned stolen art, created a museum, confronted family history. Feels like the end of the story. Or the beginning of a new chapter, I suggested. The museum's established now. We've got education programs, community partnerships, international recognition. Time to figure out what we really want to do with this platform. What do you want to do? I looked around the vault at beauty, born from crime, preservation emerging from toxicity, truth excavated from decades of lies. I want to find more warehouses, I said. Not literal ones, but places where beauty got buried under toxicity. Stories that need excavating. Transformations waiting to happen. Emma smiled. The Chin Foundation for Toxic Transformations? Something like that, I agreed, though we'll work on the name. As the evening wound down, I made a final walk through the museum. From the Hazmat displays to the vault exhibits, from the Education Center brass plate, now prominently displayed with its story, to the new second vault memorial, every space told part of our larger narrative. Tom found me on the roof observation deck we'd added in year 2, looking out over Chicago's skyline. The city sparkled in the darkness, beautiful and complex, hiding who knows how many secrets in its industrial bones. Hell of a journey, he said, joining me at the rail. Not over yet, I replied. Foster says the international investigation will continue for years. New revelations keep emerging from those files. You worried? No, I said, surprising myself with the honesty. We've faced every revelation so far. We'll face whatever comes next. Even if more personal connections emerge? Especially then, the personal connections are what make it real, what transform it from history to humanity. We stood in comfortable silence. 2 men who'd started as contractor and lawyer and become something more through shared discovery. Below us, the last visitors were leaving, the museum settling into its night routine. Soon the security guards would begin their rounds, protecting artifacts and stories and the ongoing transformation of a place that refused to let its toxic past define its future. You know what the real miracle is? Tom said eventually. What? That you bid $1,001, $1 less, and Holbrook gets it. $1 more, and maybe he keeps bidding. But 1,001? That was the exact right number at the exact right moment. Lucky guess, I said. No, he disagreed. That was instinct. The same instinct that made you dig deeper when you found the first hatch. That made you tell the truth about your father. That made you build this place instead of taking the money and running. You make me sound more noble than I am. Or maybe you're more noble than you think. As we headed back inside, my phone buzzed. Sarah, texting from home. News van outside. Something about a third vault? Please tell me this is a joke. I showed Tom the message. He laughed, the sound echoing in the stairwell. What are the odds? He asked. In this place? I looked back at the warehouse that had transformed from toxic waste site to crime scene, to museum, to community center. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised by anything anymore. Would you look for it? If there really was a third vault, I thought about Victor Kaplan's knowing smile, about Brennan's paranoid brilliance, about the patterns within patterns we'd been uncovering for 3 years. Yeah, I admitted, I probably would. Even knowing what it might cost, what it might reveal. Especially then, I said. That's what we do here. We dig through the toxic to find the beautiful. We face hard truths to build better futures. We transform warehouses and ourselves in the process. As we reached the main floor, I could see the news van Sarah had mentioned, a reporter doing a stand-up with our entrance in the background. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new investigations, new revelations. The warehouse's story was far from over, but tonight, walking through the museum we'd built from industrial bones and criminal secrets, I felt the satisfaction of work well done. Not perfect work, nothing about this journey had been perfect, but necessary work, transformative work. The warehouse had taught me that the most toxic places could hide the most valuable treasures. That secrets, once revealed, lost their power to poison. That sometimes the best way to honor the past was to transform it into something better. And if there was a third vault, well, we'd face that tomorrow. Tonight, I was going home to my family, to the life we'd built in the shadow of this strange and wonderful place. Tomorrow could bring its own discoveries. After all, I'd learned to appreciate the value of patient transformation, $1,001 at a time. The news van's speculation about a third vault turned out to be premature, a reporter's wishful thinking based on misinterpreted FBI chatter. But their presence that night marked the beginning of something else entirely. The warehouse's evolution from local curiosity to international phenomenon. Within 6 months, we'd hosted delegations from 12 countries, all wanting to understand how we'd transformed a toxic site into a thriving cultural center. It was during one such visit that everything changed again. Dr. Kenji Tanaka from Tokyo's National Museum arrived on a brutally cold February morning, 3.5 years after we'd opened. I met him at the entrance, watching him study our building with an intensity that seemed excessive even for a museum professional. Mr. Chen, he said after introductions, I must confess something. I am not here only to study your transformation methods. Oh, my grandfather was Hiroaki Tanaka. During World War II, he was forced to catalog art for the Japanese military. After the war, he spent decades trying to locate pieces that disappeared during occupation. He paused, choosing words carefully. Before he died, he told me about an American he'd corresponded with in the 1,960 seconds, a man who claimed to have information about missing Asian artifacts. Alexander Brennan, I said, you know this already? After 3 years of revelations, Dr. Tanaka, nothing surprises me. But we've found no Asian art in either vault. That, he said quietly, is because you haven't found where he displayed his most precious possessions. May I show you something? From his briefcase, he produced a yellowed envelope. Inside were photographs grainy, black and white, clearly taken in secret. They showed a room I didn't recognize, walls lined with what appeared to be Asian scrolls, ceramics, and paintings. But what made my pulse quicken was a detail in the corner of one photo, a distinctive brass plate in the floor, partially visible beneath a carpet edge. Your grandfather took these? No. They were sent to him anonymously in 1973, a year before his death. He believed they were from someone inside Brennan's organization, someone with conscience. Tanaka studied my face. The brass plate I've researched your building extensively. You have 2 such plates marking vault entrances. Had, I corrected. They're both displayed now as part of the exhibitions. But in your architectural surveys, there's a third space marked only as structural support. Northeast corner of the building, sub-basement level 3. I thought about the building plans I'd memorized over years of renovation. There was indeed an area we'd never accessed, deemed too structurally important to investigate. Our engineers had reinforced it from the outside, but never breached the walls. Even if you're right, I said, that area is load-bearing. We can't just, I'm not suggesting you tear down walls, Tanaka interrupted. I'm suggesting the entrance isn't through walls at all. In Japanese architecture, we often hide entrances in plain sight. What looks structural might be decorative. What seems solid might be illusion. Sarah found us 3 hours later in the museum's mechanical room, surrounded by blueprints and Tanaka's photographs, trying to match architectural details across 5 decades of modifications. Should I ask why there's an international art expert crawling through our ventilation system? She said. Doctor, Tanaka thinks there's a third vault, I explained. One specifically, for Asian art, hidden differently than the others. Of course there is. She studied the photographs over my shoulder. Have you called Agent Foster? Not yet. We're just theorizing, Marcus Chin. You are physically incapable of just theorizing about hidden vaults in this building. You're going to investigate, probably find something incredible, and definitely complicate our lives further. She sighed. At least let me call Tom first. And maybe warn the staff that we're about to be in the news again. She was right, of course. Within hours, I'd assembled the usual team. Tom arrived with liability waivers. Foster showed up with a junior agent and the weary expression of someone who'd stopped being surprised by our discoveries. James brought his tools and Paula her documentation equipment. Even Emma flew in from Boston, where she was working on her thesis about transformative museum spaces. The band's back together, she said cheerfully. So where's this third vault? The search took 2 days. Unlike the first 2 discoveries, which had been accidental, this was methodical. We used ground-penetrating radar, ultrasonic imaging, and what Tanaka called traditional intuition, which seemed to involve a lot of standing still and feeling the building's energy. It was Emma who found it, naturally. The younger generation always seemed to see what we missed. Dad, look at this. She was in the northeast corner of sub-basement 3, running her hands along what appeared to be a solid concrete support pillar. The temperature's different here, cooler, like there's airflow behind it. James examined the pillar with professional interest. The concrete's newer than the surrounding structure, maybe 1,950 seconds pour, based on the aggregate pattern. So Brennan built a fake support pillar? Paula asked. Not fake, Tanaka corrected. It's actually bearing load. Brilliant, really. You couldn't tear it down without risking the building above. But he walked around the right pillar, studying its base. Traditional Japanese hiding places often use rotation rather than removal. What if it turns? A 20-foot concrete pillar? That would weigh tons. Unless it's not solid, James said, already examining the base more carefully. Look here, there's a seam. Barely visible, but it's there. This thing is hollow, probably steel-reinforced concrete shell on a pivot system. Foster stepped forward. Before anyone starts spinning concrete pillars, let me remind you this is potentially a crime scene. We need proper documentation, safety protocols. Found the mechanism, Emma announced. She'd located a section of floor that depressed slightly under pressure. It's like a giant puzzle lock. You have to step on specific spots in sequence. How could you possibly know the sequence? Tom asked. Because, Emma said, pointing to worn spots on the floor, someone's been using it. Recently, these wear patterns aren't 50 years old. The room fell silent. We'd assumed we were uncovering abandoned secrets. The idea that someone had been accessing a hidden vault in our building, even after the museum opened, changed everything. Security footage? I said. Paula, can you? Already pulling it up, she said, tablet in hand. But Marcus, we only have cameras in public areas. This mechanical space isn't monitored. Foster was already on her radio, calling for a forensics team. But I could see Emma working out the pattern, her engineering mind reconstructing the sequence from wear marks. I think I've got it, she said. It's elegant, actually. Based on the Fibonacci sequence. See, the worn spots correspond to Emma, Sarah said sharply. Maybe we should wait for the FBI to, but Emma was already stepping on the pressure points in sequence. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. A grinding sound filled the room, stone against metal, mechanisms that hadn't been publicly activated in decades, responding to the correct input. The massive pillar began to rotate, slowly, majestically, revealing what it had hidden for so long. "Nobody move," Foster commanded, but we were all frozen anyway. Behind the pillar was exactly what Tanaka's photographs had shown, a room perhaps 30 feet square, walls lined, floor to ceiling with artifacts. But unlike the water-damaged second vault, this space was pristine. Climate control hummed softly. Subtle lighting, illuminated scrolls, ceramics, paintings, and sculptures with museum-quality care. And in the center of the room, seated at a low Japanese-style desk, was Victor Kaplan. He looked up from the scroll he'd been studying, entirely unsurprised by our entrance. "Ah," he said, "I was wondering when you'd find this one." "Hello again, Mr. Chen." The next moments were chaos. Foster drew her weapon, ordering Victor to show his hands. Tom started reciting legal warnings. Sarah pulled Emma back from the entrance. But Victor simply sat there, ancient and calm, like we'd interrupted his afternoon tea. "I'm 92 years old, Agent Foster," he said mildly. "Pointing a gun at me seems excessive." "You've been trespassing in a federal crime scene," Foster said, not lowering her weapon. "Accessing stolen artifacts." "I've been maintaining Alexander's most precious collection," Victor corrected, "as I have every week for 35 years. Someone had to keep the climate control functioning, check for insects, ensure the scrolls were properly rotated to prevent damage." "You knew about this when we met," I said, finding my voice. "You sent me to the second vault knowing I'd eventually find this." "The second vault was bait," he acknowledged. "Damaged goods and old records to satisfy your curiosity. This," he gestured around the room, "this was Alexander's soul, his private meditation space, the only place he found peace." Tanaka had entered behind us, tears streaming down his face as he recognized pieces from his grandfather's list. "The Autumn Moon Scroll," he whispered. "The Heian period ceramics. These have been missing for 80 years. Missing from museums and private collections that never deserved them," Victor said. "Alexander didn't steal randomly, you know. He took pieces that were themselves stolen, looted during wars, acquired through colonial exploitation, bought with blood money. He saw himself as a custodian, protecting art from those who'd already proven they couldn't be trusted with it." "That's a romantic interpretation of grand larceny," Foster said, finally lowering her weapon but keeping it ready. "Perhaps," Victor agreed. "But look at this room. Look at how he cared for these pieces. Every scroll perfectly preserved, every ceramic properly supported, every painting maintained with techniques most museums didn't even know in his time. He studied conservation with the same obsession he studied acquisition." I moved into the room, drawn by the artifacts, despite everything. The walls told the story of Asian art across millennia: Chinese bronzes, Japanese scrolls, Korean ceramics, Southeast Asian sculptures. Each piece was labeled with meticulous care, not just with standard museum information, but with personal notes about their history, their journey, their significance. "Why maintain this?" I asked Victor. "Why not vanish with the others when Brennan died?" "Because someone had to," he said simply. "These pieces, they're not just objects, they're cultural memory. Alexander understood that. He made me promise to protect them until the right moment." "And when was that supposed to be?" Victor smiled. "When someone who understood transformation found them, someone who wouldn't just return them like trophies, but would understand the complexity of their journey. I read about your museum, Mr. Chen, about how you've handled each revelation with nuance. You don't simplify the narrative. You show how beauty and crime intertwine, how good people can do bad things and bad people can preserve good things. So you've been waiting for me to find this? I've been maintaining it while waiting for someone worthy to find it. There's a difference." He stood slowly, joints protesting. I'm tired, Mr. Chen. 92 years is a long time to keep secrets. I'm ready to pass the responsibility to someone younger. Foster stepped forward. Mr. Kaplan, you're under arrest for, I know, he said peacefully. I've been expecting this for decades. But first, let me show you something that will complicate your neat categories of victim and thief. He moved to a section of scrolls, selecting one with practiced ease. Unrolling it revealed exquisite calligraphy and a landscape that seemed to breathe with life, despite being centuries old. This scroll, he said, was in the Tokyo National Museum until 1923. Officially, it was destroyed in the Great Kanto earthquake. In reality, a corrupt curator sold it to pay gambling debts. It passed through several hands before Alexander acquired it in 1961. He looked at Tanaka. Your grandfather mentions this piece in his notes, doesn't he? The Moon Over Mount Fuji by Sesshu? Tanaka nodded wordlessly, staring at a piece his grandfather had spent decades trying to locate. Now, Victor continued, you could simply return it to the Tokyo Museum. But the family of the artist has been petitioning for its return for 50 years, claiming the museum stole it from them in the Meiji Restoration. The museum says they purchased it legally. Both have documents. Both have claims. So tell me, Agent Foster, who is the rightful owner? The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Foster, for once, had no ready answer. Victor moved to another piece, a ceramic vase of impossible delicacy. This was looted from a Vietnamese temple by French colonials, sold to an American collector, donated to a museum that closed during the Depression, bought by a dealer who sold it to Alexander. The temple is gone, destroyed in the war. The village where it stood is now a city. Who owns this? You're complicating things that don't need to be complicated, Foster said, but her conviction sounded shaky. I'm revealing the complications that already exist, Victor corrected. Every piece here has such a story, layers of theft, preservation, destruction, and survival. Alexander kept detailed records of each journey. He believed that someday someone would need to untangle these knots thoughtfully, not just with legal force, but with wisdom. And you think that's me? I asked. I think, Victor said, that a man who turned a toxic waste site into a place of learning might understand how to handle toxic provenance with equal creativity. The next hours blurred together. Foster's forensics team arrived. Victor was arrested with gentle dignity, offering no resistance. The room was sealed, photographed, documented with the meticulous care we learned over 3 years of such discoveries. But the questions Victor had raised echoed through every procedural step. Tom pulled me aside as evidence teams worked. This is different from the other vaults, he said. The provenance issues here, they're not just about returning stolen goods. They're about colonialism, war, cultural heritage. Some of these pieces have 3 or 4 different entities with legitimate claims. I know. The legal fees alone could bankrupt the museum. Not to mention the international incidents you could trigger. China, Japan, Korea, they all have political sensitivities about wartime looting. I know. So what are you going to do? I watched Tanaka reverently photograph each piece, tears still streaming. What we always do, face the complexity, tell the truth, try to transform poison into medicine. The news broke within hours. Third vault discovered at Brennan Museum, caretaker arrested, but this time we were ready. Sarah had prepared statements. Emma managed social media. Paula coordinated with international press. We'd learned to surf the tsunami of attention rather than be drowned by it. Victor's arrest became a strange celebration of sorts. At his arraignment, supporters gathered with signs reading, "Hero, not criminal, and 35 years of preservation deserves praise." His lawyer, a high-powered attorney who appeared pro bono, argued that Victor's actions had actually prevented deterioration and loss of priceless artifacts. My client, she stated, committed technical trespassing to perform cultural preservation. While we don't dispute the illegal entry, we argue that his actions served a greater good that the law should recognize. The judge, clearly uncomfortable with the case's complexity, set a low bail that was immediately crowdfunded by art preservation activists. Victor was released to house arrest in a nice apartment near the museum, paid for by anonymous donors who appreciated his decades of caretaking. The third vault's contents presented challenges that dwarfed our previous discoveries. The first vault had been straightforward theft, return the paintings to museums and collectors. The second vault was mostly too damaged to matter, and the documents were evidence. But the third vault, we need an ethics committee. I told the board during an emergency meeting, international experts in art law, cultural heritage, post-colonial repatriation, this isn't something we can handle internally. Board member Sandra Williams, a former State Department official, nodded. I can reach out to UNESCO. This is exactly the kind of situation they were created to address. We also need to consider the human story, added Robert Kim, our newest member. Victor Kaplan spent 35 years of his life protecting these pieces. Whatever we think of Brennan's crimes, Victor's dedication means something. Over the following months, we assembled what media dubbed the Vault 3 Commission, experts from a dozen countries tasked with untangling the provenance of 147 pieces of Asian art. Their meetings, held in our conference room, sometimes resembled academic seminars, sometimes diplomatic negotiations, occasionally barely controlled shouting matches. Dr. Lu Wei from Beijing and Professor Yamamoto from Tokyo spent one memorable afternoon in heated debate about a Tang Dynasty bronze that had traveled through 3 wars and 5 countries. Maria Santos from the Philippines presented evidence that several pieces looted by Spanish colonizers had been re-looted by Americans, then sold to Japanese collectors, then stolen by Brennan. It's like archaeological layers, Emma observed, sitting in on sessions for her thesis. Each theft leaves a trace, creating a record of international crimes spanning centuries. Victor, under house arrest, became an unexpected ally. His lawyer negotiated permission for him to consult with the commission, sharing decades of knowledge about each piece's journey. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, he seemed happier than when we'd first met, unburdened by secrets, finally able to share what he'd preserved. You have to understand, he told the commission during one session, Alexander saw himself as a temporary guardian. He always believed these pieces would eventually return to where they belonged. He just didn't trust the institutions of his time to make those decisions. So he made himself judge and jury, Dr. Liu said coldly. Yes, Victor agreed. Arrogant, criminal, but not entirely wrong. How many pieces in your museum, Dr. Liu, were acquired during the Cultural Revolution? How many in yours, Professor Yamamoto, came from occupied territories? We're all complicit in historical theft. The question is how we address it now. The Commission's work attracted international attention. Delegations arrived from multiple countries. Diplomatic tensions arose when competing claims emerged. The museum became a neutral ground for discussions that had implications far beyond art. Through it all, the museum continued its regular operations. School groups still toured the toxic waste exhibits. Families still marveled at the first vault's reproduction paintings. The second vault's documents had been digitized and made available to researchers worldwide, spawning dozens of academic papers about art crime networks. But it was the third vault that transformed us from a museum into something larger, a laboratory for addressing historical injustices through dialogue rather than litigation. Emma proposed what became the breakthrough solution during a particularly contentious commission meeting. What if? She said, instead of fighting over ownership, we create a new model, rotating custody, shared digital archives, collaborative conservation? Explain. Professor Yamamoto said, take the moon over Mount Fuji scroll. The Tokyo Museum has a claim. The artist's family has a claim. Instead of choosing one, what if both share custody? 6 months in Tokyo, 6 months with the family, with full digital documentation available globally. Both parties become stakeholders in its preservation. Impractical? Dr. Liu objected. The logistics alone. Less impractical than endless lawsuits. Robert Kim interjected. And it acknowledges multiple valid claims without declaring a single winner. The idea evolved over weeks of debate. What emerged was the Brennan Protocol, a framework for handling artifacts with contested provenance through shared custody, collaborative conservation, and open digital access. It wasn't perfect. Some parties refused to participate. others saw it as legitimizing theft. But for many pieces, it offered a path forward that honored complexity rather than demanding simple answers. The first test came with a Korean Celadon vase claimed by both a Seoul museum and a Buddhist temple. Under the Brennan Protocol, they agreed to 3-year rotating custody, with both institutions contributing to conservation costs and sharing research access. The handover ceremony, held at our museum, became a model for cultural cooperation. This is what transformation looks like, I told the gathered dignitaries, not erasing the past, but building better futures from its fragments. Victor attended the ceremony, special permission granted by the court. At 93, he moved slowly but remained sharp, offering commentary that blended historical knowledge with hard-won wisdom. Alexander would have hated this, he told me afterward. The publicity, the cooperation, the transparency. He believed in control, in possession, but perhaps that's why it's right. We're doing what he couldn't letting go. His trial, when it finally came, was anticlimactic. The prosecutor, faced with a defendant who'd freely confessed to trespassing but had arguably prevented millions in deterioration damage, recommended probation and community service. The judge, perhaps influenced by the hundreds of letters from museum professionals worldwide praising Victor's preservation efforts, agreed. "Mr. Kaplan," she said during sentencing, "your actions were illegal but not malicious. You preserved cultural heritage at personal risk for no gain." While the court cannot condone breaking and entering, it recognizes the unique circumstances. You're sentenced to 3 years probation and 500 hours of community service to be served at the Brennan Warehouse Museum, educating others about art preservation. The courtroom erupted in applause. Victor, tears in his eyes, bowed deeply to the judge, then to the assembled crowd, then to me. "Thank you," he whispered, "for understanding, for transforming Alexander's obsession into something meaningful." The third vault's revelation changed the museum's trajectory permanently. We became not just a destination, but a resource, a place where complicated questions about art, ownership, and justice could be explored without simple answers being imposed. Universities sent students, governments sent delegations. UNESCO cited the Brennan Protocol as a model for addressing colonial-era thefts. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. My father's inadvertent role in art theft had haunted me since its discovery. Working through the third vault's complexities helped me understand how good people could be caught in bad systems, how individual choices intersected with historical forces beyond personal control. Emma captured it best in her thesis defense, which I watched via live stream from Boston. The Brennan Warehouse Museum, she argued, demonstrates that transformation isn't about perfection, but about process. Each vault revealed different aspects of human failure, greed, complicity, obsession, but the museum's response shows how those failures can become foundations for better practices, how poison can become medicine if processed with wisdom and patience. She got her doctorate, of course, Dr. Emma Chin, Museum Studies, with a job offer from the Smithsonian that she turned down to come home and help run what we'd built together. "The Smithsonian's amazing," she explained over dinner at Dorothy May's, "but they're already transformed. I want to work where transformation is still happening." 3 months after Victor's sentencing, we opened the third vault to public viewing. Unlike the first two, which remained static exhibits, this space became dynamic artifacts, rotating according to Brennan Protocol agreements. New pieces arriving as provenance was researched, stories evolving as more information emerged. Victor, fulfilling his community service, gave weekly talks about preservation techniques. His sessions, limited to 20 people, sold out months in advance. At 93, he'd become an unlikely celebrity, the art thief's assistant who'd spent decades protecting what his employer had stolen. "People ask if I regret my choices," he said during one talk. "Of course I do. I regret not pushing Alexander to return pieces during his lifetime. I regret the decades of secrecy. But I don't regret preserving these objects. Beauty deserves protection, even when it's in the wrong hands." A year later, Victor passed quietly in his sleep. His funeral, held at the museum, drew hundreds of former FBI agents who'd investigated him, museum directors who'd benefited from his knowledge, activists who'd adopted him as a symbol of complicated justice. Emma gave the eulogy, speaking about transformation and redemption, about how the worst actions could sometimes preserve the best objects. Victor Kaplan, she said, was a man caught between crime and preservation, between loyalty and ethics. He chose a middle path that satisfied no one fully but served a purpose none of us anticipated. He kept beauty alive in darkness until light could find it. That's not a perfect legacy, but it's a human one. His will contained one last surprise. He'd left journals, detailed accounts of his decades with Brennan, insights into the man behind the crimes, observations about art and obsession, and the price of secrecy. He'd also documented every visit to the third vault, creating a preservation log that became invaluable to conservators. But the most significant bequest was a letter to me, delivered by his lawyer after the funeral. "Dear Mr. Chen," it read, "by now, you've discovered all of Alexander's vaults. Yes, all three. No more hidden spaces, despite what sensation seekers might claim. You've also discovered that transformation isn't a destination, but a journey. The warehouse will continue revealing stories because every object contains multitudes. I leave you not with answers, but with a question. What will you transform next? The warehouse was your first project, but surely not your last. Poison exists everywhere, waiting to become medicine. You've proven you have the patience and wisdom for such alchemy. Thank you for showing an old man that his crimes could serve redemption. Thank you for understanding that preservation and theft could coexist in one heart. Thank you for transforming Alexander's madness into education. With respect and hope for your future transformations, Victor Kaplan, P.S. Check behind the filing cabinet in your office. One last gift, not stolen, I promise." Behind the filing cabinet, I found a package wrapped in archival paper. Inside was a painting, small, exquisite, clearly old but unfamiliar. The note attached explained, "Painted by my wife, Sophia, in 1953. She understood my conflicts before I did. She painted what she saw, a man caught between light and shadow, preservation and crime. I kept it in the vault, not because it was stolen, but because it was true. Now it belongs with someone who understands such contradictions." The painting hangs in my office, still a woman's perception of a man's moral complexity, a reminder that transformation begins with acknowledging our shadows. 2 years after Victor's death, the museum completed its most ambitious project yet. Using settlement funds and donations, we purchased the abandoned chemical plant adjoining our property, another toxic site awaiting transformation. The expansion would double our space, allowing for broader exhibitions about industrial history, environmental justice, and art's role in social change. "You sure about this?" James asked as we surveyed the new property. "One toxic transformation nearly killed us. You're voluntarily taking on another?" "It's what we do," I said. "Find poison, process it, produce medicine. Besides, who else would be crazy enough to try?" The second transformation took 3 years. No hidden vaults this time, just the ordinary horrors of industrial contamination and the ordinary miracles of human determination. Emma led the project, applying lessons from our first experience while innovating new approaches. The expanded museum opened on the 10th anniversary of my $1,001 bid. The ceremony drew thousands, former skeptics, now supporters, international delegations studying our methods, local families who'd watched us transform their neighborhood from industrial wasteland to cultural destination. Sarah and I stood on the roof deck, watching crowds explore spaces that had once been too toxic for human presence. Emma joined us, along with Tom, Paula, James, the core team that had lived through every revelation and revolution. 10 years? Sarah marveled. "From bankruptcy to this. From one warehouse to 2, Tom added. From local contractor to international consultant on toxic site transformation. Indeed, the Brennan model had spawned similar projects worldwide. Contaminated sites in Detroit, Manchester, and Sao Paulo were being reimagined as cultural spaces. We consulted on each, sharing hard-won knowledge about processing industrial poison and historical trauma simultaneously. "What's next?" Paula asked. "We've conquered toxic waste and art crime. What's left?" I thought about Victor's question, "What will you transform next?" The answer had become clear over years of processing poison into beauty. It wasn't about finding the next warehouse, but about recognizing that transformation itself was the goal. Everything's left, I said. Every abandoned space, every buried secret, every toxic legacy waiting for someone patient enough to process it. We just keep going, $1,001 at a time. Emma laughed. The Chen family business turning poison into medicine since 2019. Could be worse family businesses, I said, thinking of my father's unwitting involvement in art theft, of how that shame had transformed into understanding and eventually into purpose. As the celebration continued below, I reflected on the journey from desperate contractor to accidental museum founder to intentional transformer of toxic spaces. The warehouse had taught me that the worst places often hide the best possibilities, that secrets revealed lose their power to poison, that beauty and crime intertwine in ways that demand wisdom rather than judgment. Victor was right. Transformation isn't a destination, but a journey. The warehouse would continue revealing stories because every object, every space, every person contains multitudes. Our job was simply to keep digging, keep cleaning, keep transforming, trusting that poison processed with patience and wisdom could indeed become medicine. The museum lights glowed against the darkening sky, beacons of possibility in a city that knew both industrial triumph and industrial failure. Below, in vaults once hidden, artifacts told stories of theft and preservation, of beauty surviving despite humanity's worst impulses. Above, in galleries carved from toxic space, visitors learned that transformation was possible, that the worst failures could become foundations for better futures. And in my office, Victor's wife's painting caught the last light of day, a man between shadow and light, crime and preservation, caught forever in the amber of art's honest gaze. It reminded me daily that we all contain such contradictions, that transformation begins with accepting our shadows along with our light. The warehouse had one more lesson, delivered 10 years after that desperate auction bid. Sometimes the most toxic investments yield the most beautiful returns, not in spite of their poison, but because someone was willing to stay, to clean, to transform. Someone willing to bid $1 more than seemed sensible, then follow that foolish courage wherever it led. As I locked the museum that night, I smiled at the brass nameplate we'd installed by the entrance, the Brennan Warehouse Museum, where poison becomes medicine. Emma had wanted something more poetic, but I preferred the directness. We were what we were, alchemists of abandoned spaces, processors of historical toxins, believers that beauty could emerge from the worst origins if tended with patience and wisdom. The toxic warehouse on South Paulina Street had become something unimaginable, a place where art crime became education, where industrial poison became environmental awareness, where family shame became institutional purpose. Proof that transformation, while never perfect, was always possible for those willing to do the work, and the work would continue. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new opportunities to transform poison into medicine. But tonight, walking through galleries built on toxic ground, surrounded by stories of human failure and human resilience, I felt the deep satisfaction of work well done. The warehouse had made good on its promise, revealing treasures worth far more than the $450 million in stolen art. It had revealed that transformation was always possible, that the worst spaces could hide the best surprises, that sometimes the most desperate bids yield the most unexpected returns. $1,001. Such a small price for such large lessons. Such a modest investment for such profound returns. The toxic temple had become a palace of transformation, and we were all its grateful servants, processing poison into beauty, one revelation at a time.